The man standing outside the Piedmont cotton mill on that November morning in 1910 did not look like a threat. He wore a wool overcoat, slightly too large for his frame, and carried a lunch pail that clinked softly when he walked. His shoes were sensible and dusty. His expression was the mailed, preoccupied expression of a man who had somewhere to be, and no particular urgency about getting there. The guard at the gate, a broad-shouldered man named Carver, who smelled of tobacco and had no particular interest in the morning beyond finishing his shift, looked at the visitor and saw nothing worth worrying about. Louis Wicks Hine handed over a business card. It said he was with the State Fire Inspector's office. He was not with the State Fire Inspector's office. He was a sociologist and a photographer, 36 years old, employed by the National Child Labor Committee. And hidden in his lunch pail was a Graflex camera, large format, the kind of camera that required you to stand still and mean it, the kind of camera that committed to what it saw. He had loaded it with glass plates that morning in the boarding house where he was staying, working by lamplight because the sun wasn't up yet. He had done this in 31 states. He had done this in coal mines and glass factories and fish canneries and tobacco fields and city streets at midnight. He had been threatened, followed, and on one occasion a mill foreman had grabbed him by the lapels and told him that if he came back, his camera would end up in the river. He had come back. Carver waved him through. The mill opened before dawn. It had to. There were 1,200 spindles to get running, and the cotton didn't care what time the sun came up, and neither did the foreman, and neither did the payroll. The morning shift began at 5:30 and ended at 5:30. And in between those two facts was a 12-hour stretch of time that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never stood on a factory floor and felt the noise enter their body at the cellular level, the way the machines didn't just make sound, but made vibration, a low continuous shaking that started in the soles of your feet and worked upward until it lived somewhere behind your eyes. Flossie Cutshaw had been on the floor for 11 months. She was 9 years old, 4 feet tall. She weighed perhaps 55 pounds, which is what a large bag of flour weighs, which is what you would think about if you watched her move, the way she navigated the row of spinning frames. Each frame taller than she was, each frame a wall of moving parts and whirring bobbins and thread under tension, with a practiced economy that looked, if you weren't paying attention, almost like ease. She was not at ease. She had learned not to show difficulty, because showing difficulty attracted the foreman's attention, and the foreman's attention was never good. Her hair was tucked under a cotton cap that she'd made herself from mill scraps. Her dress was the color of old cream, and there were grease stains on the hem from where she'd crawled under the frames to retrieve dropped bobbins without anyone having to stop the machine. Because you didn't stop the machine. You worked around the machine, because the machine was what mattered, and the children were what served it. She wore shoes that had belonged to her older brother before he grew out of them, and they were half a size too large, and she had learned to walk in a particular way that accounted for this, a slight shuffle that she had stopped noticing months ago. The spinning frames stood at roughly 5 feet, adult height. They had been designed for adult hands, adult reach, adult eye line. The thread guides were positioned where an adult could see them without bending. The bobbin rails were at adult hip height. The machine asked for a body that Flossie did not yet have, and would not have for years, and it asked for it anyway, and got it, because the mill was paying her 25 cents a day, and had therefore purchased the right to ask. Hine saw her from across the floor. He had been moving slowly, as he always moved in mills, slowly enough to seem purposeful, quickly enough not to linger where a foreman might find him lingering. He was making notes on a small pad of paper, writing in a cramped hand that no one watching him would have been able to read. The temperature of the room, which was excessive, the number of children visible, which was 11, the age of the youngest visible child, which he estimated at 8 or 9, the noise level, which he wrote as simply enormous, He noted the cotton dust in the air, the way it moved in the thin light coming through the high windows, the way it had settled on every surface in a pale gray film that coated the machines and the floors and the children alike, so that everyone and everything in the room looked as though they were slowly becoming the same thing. Then he saw Flossie. She was reaching up to the bobbin rail of her spinning frame, her arms extended above her head at full stretch, her heels lifting off the floor with the effort, and she was perhaps 4 bobbins short of being able to reach what she needed. She solved this problem the way she always solved it, by pulling over a wooden crate she kept beside the frame for exactly this purpose, stepping up onto it, completing her task, stepping down, pushing the crate back with her foot, and continuing. The whole sequence accomplished in maybe 15 seconds, practiced to the point of reflex, without a pause or a break, or any acknowledgement that what she was doing was extraordinary. She was 9 years old, reaching up to a machine built for someone twice her size, in a room full of cotton dust that she had been breathing for 11 months, and she had not learned this adaptation in a school. She had learned it on the floor. Lewis Hine stopped walking. He reached into his lunch pail. He did not hurry. Hurrying attracted notice, and notice meant the plates got destroyed, and destroyed plates meant children like this one went unrecorded, and unrecorded meant it was easier to pretend they didn't exist, and the whole system depended on pretending they didn't exist. He worked by touch, which he had practiced. He brought the Graflex up to eye level, adjusted the angle. The foreman was at the far end of the room, his back turned, and he took the photograph. He wrote in his notebook, "Girl at spinning frame, Lancaster, South Carolina, November 1910. 9 years old, approximately 48 inches tall, has worked at mill approximately 11 months. Name, Flossie, last name to verify. Crate used to reach bobbin rail." He looked at what he had written. He looked at Flossie, who had not seen him, who was already moving to the next frame in her row, already reaching, already working. He wrote one more thing. This photograph will take 28 years to save anyone. He did not know he was right. He was hoping he was wrong. He was not wrong. The cotton mill town of Graniteville, South Carolina. And it was a town, not just a factory, which was the point, which was always the point, sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges of scrub pine, the kind of landscape that is beautiful at a distance and hot and brown up close. The Piedmont Mill stood at the center of it, the way a church might stand at the center of a different kind of town. The largest building, the most permanent building, the building that everything else oriented itself around. The mill village spread outward from it in neat rows of company-owned cottages, 2 rooms and a porch and a garden patch out back, and the company store at the end of Main Street, and the company school that had been open 2 months out of the year since anyone could remember, and beyond that the company church which the company pastor ran, and in which the company's benevolence was annually confirmed. The Cutshaw family had been in their cottage for 3 years. Before that, they had been in Gaston County, North Carolina, at the Lowell Mills, and before that Wick Cutshaw had been a farm tenant in Spartanburg County, farming land that wasn't his, and taking 30% of what the land made, and before that, well, before that was a time Wick didn't discuss with the children, because there wasn't anything useful in it. Wick Cutshaw was 34 years old and looked 45. He was a loom fixer, which meant he kept the looms running, which meant he was the person the floor supervisors came to when a machine broke down and production stopped and the foreman's blood pressure climbed. He was good at it. He was precise and calm and had the mechanical intuition that certain men develop who spend their lives intimate with machines. Not affection, exactly, but understanding, the way you can understand something you don't love. He made $8 a week. In a world where $8 a week was enough, this would have been a different story. $8 a week was not enough. The rent on the cottage was $1.50. The company store was the only store within walking distance, and its prices were the prices the company set, and the company set them the way all monopolies set prices, which is to say, higher than competition would have allowed. A family of 5 ate approximately $4 in food each week if they were careful, which the Cutshaws were. Flossie's mother Vera being the kind of woman who could stretch a pound of dried beans across 3 days. Coal for heating was another $1 in winter months. Shoes wore out. Children grew. The arithmetic of it, the actual specific arithmetic, meant that on Wick Cutshaw's wages alone, in a month with ordinary expenses and no emergencies, the family ended each week with less than they had started. There was no room in this arithmetic for emergencies. There were always emergencies. Flossie's youngest brother, a 3-year-old named Buster, had a chest that rattled when it rained. The mill doctor, the company doctor to be precise, the doctor whose salary appeared in the mill's ledger, had advised camphor rubs and dry air, which cost nothing except the time Vera spent applying the camphor, time that came out of sleeping hours because all other hours were already spent. Flossie's older brother, Roy, 15, ran a carding machine on the floor above Flossie's and brought in $6 a week, which helped. Roy had gone to school through the 3rd grade, which is where school ended for children in the mill village, unless their parents could afford to not have them working, which no one could. Flossie had gone to the mill school for 1 year, at age 7, during which she had learned to write her name and to read simple sentences and to add single-digit numbers. She had liked it. She had especially liked the reading, which seemed to her, at 7, before she knew that books described worlds you could actually reach, like a kind of magic, that marks on paper could become sound in your head, that became meaning. She had been a quick learner. Her teacher, a young woman from Columbia who lasted 1 school year before returning to the city, had told Vera that Flossie had ability, that with schooling she might do something. With schooling. At 8, Flossie started in the mill. There is a phrase that appeared in mill owners' testimony before state and federal committees, in their letters to senators, in their pamphlets distributed to newspapers who were willing to print them. Small, nimble fingers. The children's small, nimble fingers, perfectly suited to the delicate work of threading and mending and doffing. The children's small, nimble fingers, which made them natural for this industry, which made their employment less an exploitation than a kind of destiny, a matching of physical gift to industrial need. This phrase was used so consistently by so many mill owners, in so many testimonies, that it had the quality of a catechism, a repeated truth that acquires authority through repetition rather than evidence. It was not true. It was a story that owners told, and then told legislators, and then legislators told journalists, and journalists told the public, until it became a settled thing that children worked in cotton mills because they were suited for it, because their bodies were right for it, as though the industry had organized itself around a biological reality rather than an economic one. The economic reality was this: children were paid a quarter of what adults were paid to do the same work. They were small enough to crawl under moving machinery to retrieve dropped material without stopping production. They were young enough not to understand that they could refuse, or that refusing was a concept that applied to them. They could not vote. They could not organize. Any child who tried was simply fired, and the family evicted from the company house, and there was always another family waiting. They were, in the language of the ledger, cheap, compliant, and replaceable. Small, nimble fingers was not a description of a natural gift. It was a marketing phrase for a labor force that had no choice. Flossie Cutshaw's fingers were not small and nimble. They were 9-year-old fingers, which is to say they were developing fingers, growing fingers, fingers that by some estimates still had another 6 years of bone formation ahead of them. They were beginning to show the calluses that the bobbins and thread guides produced, a thickening of the skin at the tips that her mother rubbed with lard at night before bed. They shook sometimes at the end of the shift, a fine tremor that Flossie noticed but didn't mention, because there was nothing to be done about it, and mentioning it would only worry her mother. She mentioned a great many things to her mother, and a great many things she did not, and the things she did not were the things that fell into the category of real, serious, and unchangeable. By 9 years old, Flossie Cutshaw had already begun to sort the world that way. She was up at 5 in the morning. This was not a difficult hour in the way it is difficult for people who sleep in beds they have chosen, in rooms they have chosen, in lives they are directing. It was a difficult hour in the way that cold water is difficult. Not surprising, not exceptional, simply a fact of the morning that had to be moved through before you arrived at the rest of the day. She dressed in the dark, feeling for her clothes on the chair where she put them each night. Her mother had usually been up for 20 minutes already, heating water for the coffee and putting cornbread in the pan from the previous night's batter. They walked to the mill together, Flossie and Vera and Roy, in the pre-dawn dark that in November came in low and wet, carrying with it a cold that had no malice in it, just indifference. They were not alone on the road. The mill village woke all at once, the way a body wakes, not gradually, but suddenly, as if a switch had been thrown, the cottages going from dark to lit, the paths filling with small figures moving toward the large lit building at the center. The building that made the noise you could hear from half a mile away, the building that was running even now, because the overnight shift was still in it, because the mill never entirely stopped. It only changed who was feeding it. Inside, the noise hit Flossie like weather. 1,200 spindles. The sound of 1,200 spindles is not describable in terms of other sounds. It is not like music, which has pattern. It is not like storm, which has variation. It is a wall of sound, continuous and absolute, that fills every cubic inch of air in the room and leaves no room for anything else. It entered through your ears, and it settled in your chest, and it vibrated your back teeth if you thought about it. And so you learned not to think about it. You learned to exist inside it the way fish exist inside water, not ignoring it exactly, but not fighting it, just becoming a body that moved through a medium that did not care about you. The foreman, a man named Teague, walked the floor with a clipboard and did not speak above the noise because there was no point in speaking above the noise. He communicated in gestures, in nods, in the particular raised eyebrow that meant faster, and the particular set of jaw that meant the machine is behind, and you are the reason the machine is behind, and the children read him as you read weather, learning the small atmospheric signs that preceded worse conditions. Flossie's row had 11 frames. She was responsible for 2 of them, the doffing, the finding of thread breaks, the cleaning of the guides. In practical terms, this meant she was moving, almost continuously, for 12 hours. Not running. Running attracted Teague's attention in a way that was worse than slowness, because it suggested panic, which suggested an incident, which required paperwork. She moved at the steady controlled pace she'd developed over 11 months, a pace that covered distance without appearing to hurry, the particular speed of a working child who has learned that efficiency is safety. The cotton dust was everywhere. It was not a cloud or a layer or a film. It was air. It was what the air was made of, in the spinning room, the way the air near the ocean is made of salt. It floated in the light from the high windows. It settled on the machinery. It settled on skin. It settled in lungs. The workers wore nothing over their faces. No masks existed in 1910 for cotton mill workers, and if they had, the company would not have provided them, because that was not a cost that appeared in the ledger under necessity. You breathed the cotton dust because you breathed, and you worked in the cotton dust because you worked, and the distinction between those two things, between the air and the danger in the air, was not one that mill owners were prepared to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have acknowledged a responsibility. Flossie had a cough that she'd had for 7 months. It was the kind of cough that lived at the back of the throat and occasionally moved deeper. In the mornings before the shift it was worse, a rough bark that shook her small frame and produced something she'd learned to spit out before her mother saw it, because the color of it worried her mother, and there was nothing to be done about the color of it. She did not connect the cough with the cotton dust in the way that a doctor might. She was 9, and causation at that level of abstraction requires a kind of education she had not received. She connected the cough with mornings, and she connected mornings with cold, and she connected cold with winter, and she had theories about the cough that were not correct, but that made it bearable. The doctors who would eventually study what happened to cotton mill workers' lungs would call it byssinosis, brown lung, a progressive disease in which the lungs' capacity slowly, irreversibly contracts, until the act of breathing becomes work. In 1910, it did not have a name in any document that mill owners were required to read. It had, in the people it was happening to, the name of that cough, or the mill cough, or sometimes just a chest, as in she's got a chest, the way you might describe weather, as a condition that existed rather than one that had been caused. What was caused, and what merely existed, that distinction was worth a great deal of money to certain people. They spent considerable effort maintaining it. Twice in a single week in September, Wick Cutshaw had sat at the kitchen table after supper with the household ledger open in front of him. A composition book, actually, bought at the company store for 10 cents, in which he kept his running accounts in a tight, cramped hand that was the hand of a man who'd had 4 years of schooling and used all of it. And he had added the numbers as many ways as they could be added, and the numbers had come out the same every time. Without Flossie's wages, they were short $2 and some cents each month. Without Roy's wages, they were short $8, which was a different kind of problem, which was not a problem, but a catastrophe. With both children working, with Vera taking in washing 3 evenings a week for the supervisor's family on the hill, with Wick working 6 days a week and the occasional Sunday when the night foreman was short. With all of that, they were not comfortable, but they were present. They ate. They were not evicted. When Buster's chest was bad, they could afford the camphor from the company store, charged to the account, paid back in installments that Wick tracked with a precision that was almost its own kind of grief. The mill had designed this. This is the thing about the Cutshaw family's impossible mathematics that is hardest to hold in your mind, because it looks like poverty, which looks like bad luck, which looks like a personal circumstance. But it was not personal. It had been engineered. The mill paid adult men like Wick $8 a week for skilled work. The mill paid unskilled adult women $4. The mill paid children between 25 and 50 cents per day, depending on age and task. These were not wages set by a market in which labor competed freely. They were wages set by an industry that in the Carolina Piedmont held near total control over the labor supply in the communities it had built around itself, communities it had built precisely so that it could hold that control. The company house meant the company could evict. The company store meant the company could control what you could buy and at what price. The company doctor meant the company could determine what your illness was and wasn't, what it caused and didn't cause. And the wages, adult wages set just below the sustainable threshold, meant that families needed children working, needed them, not as a preference or a cultural habit, as factory owners and their congressional allies would later argue when explaining why child labor legislation was an attack on the family. As a mathematical necessity that the industry had built into its operating model as deliberately as it had built the spinning frames. Wick Cutshaw knew this. He was not a stupid man. He had sat at the table with the numbers, and he had understood that the numbers were not an accident, that someone on the other side of those numbers had wanted them to come out this way, had built a system that required his daughter's body in order to run. He knew it. He could not do anything about knowing it. What he could do was sit at the table and add the columns one more time, as if the numbers might come out differently, and when they didn't, close the ledger and go to bed. In the morning, Flossie woke at 5. He never told her he was sorry. Sorry was a door he couldn't open, in the kitchen, at 5 in the morning, the mill already audible in the distance. He made sure her shoes were tied. He pressed her cap down over her ears against the cold. He watched her and Vera and Roy walk down the path toward the lit building, and he followed. And he did not let himself think about the teacher from Columbia who had said with schooling she might do something, because that sentence, opened, led to places he could not afford to go. The poverty was a feature, not a bug. The children's wages subsidized the owner's payroll. The family's dependency was not the unfortunate side effect of a wage structure. It was the intended outcome of a wage structure. The mill needed cheap labor. The cheapest available labor was children. To ensure a steady supply of children, you needed families poor enough to need their children working. To ensure families poor enough, you kept adult wages below subsistence. The circle was not vicious by accident. It had been drawn with care. This is what Cleo Ash understood, too, which is why when she sat down with mothers in mill villages across the Carolinas and Georgia and Virginia to take their testimony for the National Child Labor Committee, she did not begin with the question that reformers sometimes asked, "How can you send your children to work?" Because that question started from a place of misunderstanding, so fundamental, it would have ended the conversation before it began. She began instead with the numbers. She asked what the rent was. She asked what food cost at the company store. She asked what the father made, and what the mother made if she worked, and what the children made, and she did the arithmetic right there in the kitchen, on paper, so the mother could see it laid out, and know that Cleo had seen it too. That she understood it. That she wasn't going to stand up at the end and say something about responsibility. Cleo Ash was 31 years old, from Cincinnati, the daughter of a Methodist minister who had believed with a fervor that was both his defining quality and occasionally his most exhausting one, that the world contained problems that could be solved if you applied sufficient rigor and compassion in equal measure. She had inherited the rigor and the compassion. She had not inherited the faith that they would necessarily be sufficient. She had been working for the NCLC for 3 years, which was long enough to have accumulated a specific kind of bone-deep tiredness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the repeated experience of documenting something obviously terrible and watching the people who could stop it choose not to. She carried a leather satchel with 2 notebooks, one for testimony, written in a clear cursive that could be transcribed by the NCLC office clerks, and one for her own observations, written in a smaller, faster hand that was not for the clerks. In the testimony notebook, dates, names, wages, hours, ages, conditions as reported. In the other notebook, the mother's hands shook while she talked, not from nerves, from cold. The house had no heat, and it was October, and the company store had stopped extending credit 2 weeks ago. The NCLC published from the testimony notebook. Cleo kept the other one. She had interviewed 117 mothers across 6 states. She could have told you the average rent at a company store versus an independent store, the average price differential for flour, the average number of children in a mill family, the average age at which children started work, the average amount by which adult wages fell short of subsistence, the average length of a child's working day. She could have told you all of this. She was also able to tell you, with equal precision, that none of these averages captured what it was like to be in a mill cottage in November, with the numbers in front of you, and a child who needed shoes. She worked alongside Lewis Hine when their territories overlapped, and they had developed a mutual respect that expressed itself almost entirely in the absence of unnecessary speech. Hine photographed. Cleo interviewed. In the evenings, at whatever boarding house or hotel the NCLC's small travel budget allowed, they compared notes with the specific efficiency of people who had a great deal of work and a limited window to do it in. Hine showed her the photographs. She showed him the testimony. Each made the other more useful. "This one," Hine said one evening in Greenville, laying a photograph on the table. "I don't have her name." Cleo looked at the image. A girl at a spinning frame. Very small. Crate under her feet. "I'll ask." She always asked, and the mothers usually told her, once they understood that Cleo was not from the mill. In the Pennsylvania coal country, which is a different kind of industrial landscape entirely. Colder, darker, the topography itself more forbidding, the mountains pressing closer, and the towns dug into the hillsides as though trying to hide from something. There was a building attached to every major mine that was called the breaker, and what the breaker did was this. It took the coal that came out of the earth and ran it through a system of chutes and rollers that broke it into uniform sizes, and as it traveled down through this system, it traveled past wooden benches bolted over the chutes, and on those benches, hunched over in rows, sat the breaker boys. Their job was to pick the slate and rock from the coal with their bare hands. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, in coal dust so thick it coated their faces, their hands, their clothing, their lungs. The coal chutes ran beneath them at an angle, and the coal clattered past continuously, and the boys reached into the stream and pulled out the rocks that weren't coal, the gray slate, the pyrite, the shale, and threw them into a separate bin, and reached again, and pulled again, for 10 hours, because the mining company needed clean coal, and children were cheaper than machines, and more adaptable too, because a machine complained to no one when a supervisor hit it with a stick for slowing down, and the boys did not complain either, but for different reasons. Early Honeycutt was 11 years old. He would have told you he was 14, and he would have told you this quickly, with the particular confidence of someone who has rehearsed a lie until it sounds like memory. He was not quite 5 feet tall, and was thin in the way that boys who work too hard, too young, and don't eat quite enough are thin. Not starved, but depleted, as if something in him was being drawn down, gradually the way a candle is drawn down. The mass of him converting into labor and warmth and light for someone else's purposes. He was from a place called Latimer, in Luzerne County. His father was a miner. Underground, blast work, the real danger. His father had come from Slovakia 7 years ago with nothing except a willingness to go underground for wages, which in 1903 seemed to him a reasonable trade. It had remained a reasonable trade, right up until the moment a roof fall in the number 4 shaft had crushed his father's right arm, to the point where the arm was still present, but the mining was finished. The arm had been set by the company doctor, and the company had given his father 2 weeks of pay, and thereafter considered the matter closed. There was no workers' compensation. There was no disability payment. There was the father, his arm in a sling, and the family, which now needed a different source of income. Early had started in the breaker the following Monday. That was 6 months ago. He had been 10 then. He was 11 now by the calendar, though the calendar seemed less and less relevant the longer he sat hunched over the chute. Time in the breaker moved the way time moves in repetitive enclosed spaces, in a kind of suspension, an extended present tense in which each moment was identical to the last and the next, the coal moving past, and the hands moving into the coal, and the rock coming out, and the coal continuing, world without end. He sat between a boy named Drago, who was 13, and whom Early had identified early on as the person most likely to know how things worked and least likely to explain them, and a boy named Mickey Sullivan, who was 8, and who cried sometimes at the beginning of the shift and not at the end, which was not because he felt better at the end, but because, by the end, he no longer had the energy for it. Early was not unkind to Mickey Sullivan. He passed him the better piece of his lunch sometimes, which was not generosity so much as recognition, an instinct to protect the smallest thing near you, when you are yourself not large. The foreman in the breaker was a man whose name Early never learned, because nobody used it. They called him the boss. The boss walked the rows with a stick, actually a stick, an actual length of wood, a pick handle worn smooth at one end from being held, and at the other from being applied to the backs of boys who fell behind in their sorting. He did not hit hard enough to injure, which is the kind of precision that requires practice. He hit hard enough to sting, hard enough to suggest that harder was available if required, hard enough to maintain the message that his presence communicated. The coal does not wait, and neither do I, and you are replaceable. Early had been hit twice in 6 months, both times for slowing when his fingers went numb. Both times he had not reacted, because reacting was worse than being hit, because reacting suggested that the hit had achieved something, which it had, but acknowledging that transferred something to the boss that Early was not willing to transfer. He had learned to receive the hit as weather, as external, impersonal, a thing that happened to a body without reference to the person in the body. He was 11 years old, and he had already developed a theory of how to keep himself intact. His fingers were permanently black. Not dirty black, surface black, the kind of black that comes off with soap and water, though soap and water were limited quantities in the Honeycutt house, and Early was not wasteful with them. Permanently black, ground-in black, the kind that had worked itself into the lines of his knuckles and the cracks between his fingers, that opened in the cold air, and bled a little. Dried, cracked again, bled again, the cycle continuing. His nails had broken and grown back and broken again in slightly different configurations, and there was a particular line across the pad of his right index finger, an old cut gone white, that he sometimes looked at on the walk home as a kind of landmark. Evidence that his hand had existed before the breaker, had been cut at some point before the breaker, had a history before the coal. His back was beginning to curve. This was the thing that no one mentioned, not in the Honeycutt house, not in the breaker, not in any company document. The position of the breaker boys, hunched forward over the chute, spine curved, neck bent down, held for 10 hours across 6 days across, in Early's case, 6 months, was doing to their developing spines what sustained pressure does to anything still flexible. It was reshaping them. The boys who had been in the breaker for years had a characteristic posture that was visible even when they were not at work, a persistent forward curve to the upper back, a head carried slightly forward of the center of gravity that would stay with them. The breaker was printing itself onto their bodies. The company's payroll records showed wages paid per day. They did not show spines reshaped. Lewis Hine arrived at the Latimer Colliery on a Tuesday morning in March 1911, having been denied entry the previous Friday by the mine superintendent on the grounds that he was not authorized. He returned on Tuesday as a Bible salesman, which was a disguise he used in places where the fire inspector's story seemed unlikely. He carried a Bible in his coat pocket and offered it to the guard at the gate and said he was calling on the workers' housing, would be in and out. No trouble. The guard was young and not particularly interested, and waved him through. The breaker building was easy to find. You followed the noise. The sound inside was different from the cotton mill, not the sustained mechanical roar of the spinning frames, but a continuous rocky clatter, the percussion of coal against metal, coal against coal, the breaker boys' picks and fingers against the chute, and underneath it all, a grinding that was the breaker mechanism itself. The rollers and screens, a sound that had a quality of appetite to it, as though the building itself was consuming something. The air was black. That is not hyperbole. The air in the breaker room was black with coal particulate, and within minutes of entering, Hine could feel it on his teeth and in his throat, and he understood in a bodily way, not an intellectual way, but a physical, immediate way, what it meant to spend 10 hours in this room, day after day, and what it was doing to the lungs of the boys who did. He found the rows of breaker boys, and he stopped. There were 31 of them visible. The youngest, he estimated, was perhaps 7. the oldest perhaps 15. They were hunched over the chutes in the particular posture he had seen in photographs taken by his NCLZ predecessors. Not posed, not deliberate, but structural, the body's solution to a problem it had been given without being asked. And they worked with a focus that was total and mechanical. Their eyes moving along the coal stream, their hands reaching and pulling, the slate and rock flying into the bins beside them with a practiced accuracy that was the accuracy of pure repetition. He got out his camera. He worked quickly. He had learned to work quickly in places like this. He photographed the rows. He photographed individual boys, the angle of their spines, the black hands, the focused downward stare. And then he saw Early Honeycutt, not because Early was different from the other boys in any dramatic way, but because Early looked up. Most children did not look up. They had learned that looking up was a risk, that it broke the rhythm that kept the boss's attention elsewhere. But Early looked up, directly at Hein, with an expression that Hein would describe in his notes as watchful, not frightened, not hostile, but measuring. The boy was sizing him up, exactly the way an adult would, with a precision that was startling because of how young the face doing the measuring was. Hein nodded at him. Early stared for another second, then looked back at the coal. Hein photographed him. Later, he approached the boy directly during the brief 10-minute break that the breaker allowed at midday. "I'm writing about the mines," he said, which was more or less true. "Can you tell me your name? How old you are?" Early looked at him. 14, he said. Immediately. Rehearsed. Hein nodded. He reached into his coat and produced a small notebook and a pencil. Then, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, he stood beside Early and held the notebook at vest button level. His vest, which he had sewn with buttons at precise intervals, each one representing a known measurement. He was not looking at Early. He was looking at his notebook, but he noted where the boy's head came to on his vest. He wrote, "Latimer Breaker, Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, March 1911. Boy states age 14. Height 58 inches. Inconsistent with stated age. Actual estimated age 10 to 11. Fingers heavily scarred, black, multiple healed cuts. Spinal curvature beginning. Name Early. Last name not given. Has worked at Breaker approximately 6 months." He looked at Early, who was eating half a biscuit with the focused attention of someone who has limited time and is not going to waste it. "What's your last name?" "Don't got one worth mentioning," Early said. Hein wrote Honeycutt in his notebook because the woman at the boarding house where he was staying had mentioned the Honeycutt boy who worked the Breaker, and because sometimes information arrived this way, in pieces, from people outside the gate who were less careful about what they said. Early finished his biscuit and looked at him. "You going to write something?" he said. The bravado in his voice had the quality of a coat that was slightly too large, worn to cover something smaller underneath, and not quite fitting. "Yes," Hein said. "Write that we get paid 40 cents, Early said. "Write that." He was back at his bench before the boss came through. Everyone in the coal fields lied. This is the detail that sits at the center of the child labor system, like a load-bearing wall. Without it, the structure falls. The children lied about their ages to the foreman because working required a minimum age that no one actually enforced, and everyone pretended applied, and the lie made the pretense possible. The parents signed documents attesting that their children were old enough because the documents were required and the wages were necessary, and the signature was what stood between the family and hunger. The foreman noted the ages as stated and did not look too closely at the bodies in front of them, because looking too closely created a problem that the foreman had no interest in having. The mine owners submitted the legal required filings showing their workforce as composed of adult laborers and believed or chose to believe, or arranged themselves so that they did not have to actively not believe that the filings were accurate. The state inspectors, the actual official state labor inspectors whose job it was to enforce the existing age minimums, came through every 6 months or so, at times that were known in advance through channels that need not be specified, and found the workforce in compliance and filed their reports, and left. The whole mechanism ran on lies told by people who couldn't afford the truth. The children lied because their families needed 40 cents. The parents lied because 40 cents was 40 cents. The owners accepted the lies because the lies were useful. The inspectors accepted the lies because the inspectors were paid by the state, and the state was influenced by the industry, and the industry preferred its lies remained institutional. Early Honeycutt told Hine he was 14 because being 11 was a fact that cost money he did not have. The lie was not a moral failure. It was a 40-cent survival strategy deployed by an 11-year-old boy who had worked out the arithmetic with the same bleak precision his father used to track what the company store charged for flour. He was not wrong about the arithmetic. He was wrong about the arithmetic being a permanent condition. He did not know that yet. 400 miles to the south and west, at a point where the Mississippi coast curves toward Louisiana like a shoulder turning away from something it doesn't want to see, the shrimp and oyster canneries ran year-round on a calendar, determined not by human preference, but by the movement of shellfish through warm, shallow water. The canneries were low-roofed buildings near the water, and they smelled, powerfully, permanently, of brine and shellfish, and the particular sourness of cut shellfish in warm air, a smell that did not wash out of clothing, and that became, for the families who worked in them, simply the smell of the world. The season's work began at 3:30 in the morning. This was not an unusual schedule for the cannery families. It was simply the schedule. The boats came in with the tide, and the shellfish needed processing before they spoiled, and the fact that it was 3:30 in the morning was a fact about oysters rather than a choice about labor, or at least that was how it was explained when it was explained at all, which was rarely, because the families who worked the canneries had been working them for as long as they had been in this place, and the schedule was simply the schedule. Orpha Dills was 7 years old. She had a small face under a large cotton cap, and her hands in March, which is to say near the end of the oyster season, were the hands of someone who had been working with shellfish for 4 months, chapped past redness to a raw pink that tended toward cracking at the knuckle joints, the skin dried by the salt and acid of the oyster liquor, to a texture that was rougher than the hands of most 40-year-old women. She shucked with a speed that was not fast by adult standards, but was continuous. The knife into the hinge, the twist, the shell opening, the oyster into the bucket, the shell dropped behind, continuous and steady and automatic, the way a heartbeat is automatic, the body having learned the task and taken it over from the mind, which was occupied elsewhere. Orpha's elsewhere was not particularly specified. She was 7. Elsewhere for a 7-year-old is a broad category. She thought sometimes about a dog she'd seen in town. She thought about a dress she'd seen in a window of a shop in Biloxi that was a color she didn't have a name for, somewhere between blue and green, which she called the dress color in her own mind, and which had occupied a small permanent space there since August. She thought about her brother Cal, who was 9 and worked 2 buckets down, and who sometimes, when no one was watching, rolled an oyster shell at her along the table like a marble, and she would stop the shell and roll it back, and they would be playing, briefly, in the middle of work, in a way that felt like something from a different life, visiting. Her mother worked across the table. Her mother had been working in canneries since she was Orpha's age, which means she had been shucking oysters for roughly 25 years, and she could do it fast enough that watching her was a slightly humbling experience, regardless of your own competence. Her mother's hands were the most worked hands Orpha had ever seen, mapped with old cuts, the joints enlarged, the skin a kind of uniform red that didn't change in the cold or the heat. Her mother did not complain about her hands. She did not think of them as hands that complained. They were the hands she had, and they did the work that was in front of them, and that was the entirety of what needed to be thought about them. Orpha did not know that the oyster liquor was acidic. She knew, in the way that children know things that they have not been told and cannot name, that her hands hurt more after a shift than before, that there was a stinging in the cracks that was worse at the end of the day, that cold water was not soothing to them. She did not connect this to acid. She connected it to work, and she connected work to the life she was in, and the life she was in was the only life she had data on, so there was no comparison available. She did not know that her hands hurt in a way that was different from the way hands were supposed to hurt. She had never met anyone whose hands didn't hurt. This is perhaps the cruelest thing about the system, as experienced by its youngest participants. It was not perceived as abnormal because they had nothing to measure it against. Orpha Dills had never been to school. She had been to church twice, both times at Easter, and the church had seemed to her a place where adults became temporarily different in a way she found interesting, but couldn't explain. She had never been more than 4 miles from the cannery. Her whole world was the cannery, the company housing behind it, the road between them, her mother and Cal and the oysters, and the dog in town, and the dress. She did not know the dress had a name. She did not know the color was called teal. She would never find out. The Padrone system, which organized the labor of cannery families along the Gulf Coast, worked like this. A labor contractor, the Padrone, would recruit families, often immigrant families, often from Italian or Croatian communities, to come and work the season. He would arrange their transport. He would arrange their housing, company housing, near the cannery. He would arrange their credit at the company store. And in exchange, he would take a percentage of their wages and would arrange their transport to the next location when the season moved, and would arrange the housing there and the credit there, and in this way, the families were mobile in the specific way that the oysters required, while remaining economically fixed in a system from which there was, practically speaking, no exit. The Dills family had been in it for 4 years. Cleo Ash had come to the Gulf Coast the previous fall, in October, and had spent 3 weeks interviewing families in the cannery housing. The housing was identical to the Mill Village housing and the mining camp housing in the way that all company-built worker housing of the period was identical. As though there had been one architect, somewhere, who had calculated the minimum square footage in which a family could survive without technically requiring the company to describe the housing as unfit, and had drawn up plans accordingly, and these plans had been distributed to every extractive industry in America. 2 rooms, low ceilings, 1 window, 1 door. Cleo interviewed mothers in these rooms with her notebook on her knee and the smell of shellfish coming through the walls. One interview, which she would use in a later NCLC pamphlet, the names changed, as she always changed them, had lasted 2 hours and gone through 6 pages of testimony. The mother, Cleo wrote in her observation notebook afterward, had the precise demeanor of someone who has answered these questions before, in her own head, many times, and has not found answers that satisfy her. She was 32 and looked closer to 50. She was not defensive, and she was not ashamed, and she was not hopeful. She was accurate. She gave Cleo numbers, wages, hours, ages, costs, with the accuracy of someone who had been living with these numbers for years and had done the arithmetic as many ways as arithmetic could be done. Does she know this isn't? Cleo started once, carefully. Does Orpha know that most children her age? She don't know anything different, the mother said. Not an interruption, a clarification. That's the thing. She don't know what else there is. Cleo wrote that down in both notebooks. The youngest workers in American industry were in the canneries. 5-year-olds could shuck oysters. Their hands were small enough to manage the knife, and their speed was not required to be fast, only continuous, and the acid didn't distinguish between ages. The system had identified the lowest possible age at which a human being could be put to productive labor, and had placed children there, and had called it a family business, and had called the family's dependency a tradition, and had, when reporters came around, shown them the parts of the operation where the adults worked, and not the parts where the children did. Hine came to the Gulf Coast in November of 1911. He photographed children at the shucking tables by the light of the lanterns the canneries used in the pre-dawn hours, which gave the images a quality that was partly the chemistry of early photographic plates, and partly the actual quality of the light. A dimness that made the children look in the photographs as though they were emerging from something, or disappearing into it, not quite solid, not quite there. He photographed Orpha, though he did not know her name then, and the image showed her at the table, her cap pulled low, her small hands on the shell, and what the photograph showed. And what it showed, because Hine had understood that the photograph needed to show it, was her size, relative to everything around her. The bucket was large, the table was large, the tools were large, the darkness around her was large, and she was small, and she was there, and it was 3:30 in the morning, and she was 7 years old. He wrote in his notes, Gulf Coast Cannery, Biloxi, Mississippi, November 1911. Girl estimated 7 years. Name not obtained. Shucking oysters. Work begins 3:30 a.m. Hands visibly acid damaged. Does not raise eyes during work. The last detail was the one that stayed with him. She did not raise her eyes, not because she was afraid of him. She was not afraid of him. She had not reacted to his presence at all, which was in some ways worse. She did not raise her eyes because raising her eyes would interrupt the work, and interrupting the work was not something that occurred to her as an option. The work was simply what was happening. The way breathing was what was happening, and there was no frame in which she existed that contained the concept of stopping it. He took the photograph and moved on. He was in the cannery for 3 hours before a manager found him and told him to leave. He left. He had what he needed. He had names, heights, ages, jobs, locations, times of day. He had in his glass plates faces. He had a girl who did not raise her eyes. Lewis Wicks. Hine's method was not accidental. It had been developed over 3 years of work with the NCLC, refined through trial and error and the particular education you receive when people are actively trying to stop you from documenting what they are doing. He had learned which disguises worked in which industries. The fire inspector story worked in mills, because every mill owner lived in some fear of fire insurance inspectors, and the Bible salesman story worked in mining towns, where there was a tradition of traveling religious salesmen that made him less remarkable. In the South, he had sometimes posed as a photographer, making postcards of the mill village for the company, flattering to mill owners who liked to see their enterprises documented, which gave him access, and also, occasionally, resulted in a mill owner standing proudly in front of the building, while Hine photographed the breaker boys 50 yards behind him. His camera was a Graflex, a large format instrument that required glass plates and careful handling, and was, in the physical sense, not easily hidden. What he hid was not the camera, but the evidence that it was aimed at something the factory owners didn't want documented. The Graflex required a deliberate setup, and he had learned to do this quickly and to position himself so that what he was photographing was not obvious from the angle of his body. He used his body as a shield between the camera and the attention of foremen and managers. He had been photographing things he wasn't supposed to photograph for long enough that it was almost reflexive, the way an experienced poker player's face becomes reflexively still. The glass plates were the most vulnerable part of the operation. He carried them in a padded box in his bag, and on 2 occasions, once in a Virginia mill and once in a West Virginia coal operation, men had tried to take his bag and destroy the plates. The first time, a foreman had grabbed the bag and Hine had grabbed back, and they had stood in the factory yard, pulling opposite ends of the bag, while workers watched, and Hine had not let go, which surprised the foreman enough that he had eventually let go first. The second time, someone had gotten to his boarding house room while he was out, and gone through his belongings, and had not found the plates because he had left them with the boarding house proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Peterson, who had asked no questions, and was probably the reason the photographs from that trip survived. He was not a large man. He was not, by physical presence, threatening. What he had was tenacity, a specific quality of not being stopped that expressed itself less in confrontation than in persistence, in the willingness to come back the next day with a different story, in the ability to sit in a boarding house room at midnight and reload his plates and plan the next approach, and not conclude, from the day's obstacles, that the work was impossible. He had an instinct for the image that mattered, and it was not the instinct for drama. Other photographers of the period went for obvious impact: the emaciated child, the dramatic injury, the single image of suffering designed to provoke visceral response. Hine's images were almost never that. They were specific and procedural. They showed work. They showed the body at work, the body's relationship to the machine it served, the scale of the child against the scale of the industrial infrastructure around it. They showed routine. This was deliberate. He understood, and this was the sociologist in him, the man who had been trained to think about systems rather than incidents, that what he was documenting was not a series of unfortunate accidents, but a structure, an organized system of labor that worked exactly as it was designed to work, and that the way to make this visible was not to photograph the exceptions, but to photograph the rule. The captions he attached to every photograph were part of this: name, age, height, job, location, date. He measured the children against his vest buttons because the vest buttons were calibrated, each button a specific known distance from the others, so that by noting which button came level with the top of a child's head, he could calculate height with a precision that was, in the context of a factory floor he wasn't supposed to be on, remarkable. He did this not to be impressive, but because the data mattered. A photograph of a small child at a large machine was moving. A photograph of Sadie Pfeiffer, 48 inches tall, spinner, Lancaster, South Carolina, was evidence. This distinction between moving and evidence was the core of what Hine understood about his work. Moving changed feelings. Evidence changed policy. The country had been moved by images of poverty before. Jacob Riis had been moving people with photographs of New York's poor for 20 years, and they remained poor. Hine wanted something harder to dismiss than feeling. The National Child Labor Committee used his photographs in pamphlets, which they distributed to legislators, journalists, and reform organizations. By 1911, Hine's images were appearing in newspapers in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago, with captions that included the names and ages and heights he had recorded. And these details, the specificity of them, the weight of a real name, a real age, a real measurement, had an effect that general claims about child labor did not. It was harder to argue against Sadie Pfeiffer than against mill children in South Carolina. It was harder to argue against Early Honeycutt, 11 years old, 58 inches tall, Latimer Breaker, than against boys in the coal mines. The names made them real. The measurements made them undeniable. He published a larger collection in 1913, and it was reviewed in papers that reached people who had never been within 100 miles of a cotton mill or a coal breaker. And those people wrote to their legislators, and their legislators, some of them, took notice. The NCLC supplemented Hine's work with Cleo Ash's testimony, with economic analyses, with careful legal arguments built over years by Felix Adler and the organization's staff of lawyers. The campaign for federal child labor legislation was not a campaign of outrage alone. It was a campaign of accumulation, of evidence stacked against denial until the denial became structurally unsound. This took longer than you would think. It took longer than anyone thought was acceptable. It took longer than the bodies of the children in the photographs could afford. Felix Adler, who had founded the NCLC in 1904, was an ethicist and educator, the founder of the ethical culture movement, a man of great intellectual precision and moral passion that expressed itself in prose of considerable length and occasional ferocity. He had seen the child labor question not as a reform matter, a softening of harsh conditions, but as a moral absolute. Children should not work in industry, not under improved conditions, not with better wages, not with shorter hours. Should not. Period. The precision of this position was both its strength and its political complication, because the legislative process does not reward absolutes. It rewards compromise. The NCLC would spend 30 years learning to navigate between what was right and what was politically achievable, and the navigation would never quite satisfy either goal, and the children would pay the difference. The campaign reached its first significant federal breakthrough in 1916. Representative Edward Keating of Colorado and Senator Robert Owen of Oklahoma had introduced a bill that would ban the interstate shipment of goods produced using child labor. Children under 14 in factories and mines, children under 16 in hazardous occupations. It was not everything the NCLC wanted. It was, for the first time, something. It had passed Congress after years of lobbying, years of testimony, years of photographs in pamphlets on congressional desks. President Wilson signed the Keating-Owen Act on September 1, 1916. For a period of time that can be measured in months, the children in the photographs had a federal law on their side. Then it was struck down. Nels Holmgren had been in the textile business for 26 years, which was long enough to have developed the specific confidence of a man who has never seriously needed to question his assumptions, because his assumptions had consistently produced the results he wanted. He was 53, heavyset in the way of men who eat well and work at desks, with a face that was ruddy and pleasant and carried, at all times, the expression of a man who genuinely believed he was one of the good ones. He had inherited the Holmgren mill from his father, had expanded it twice, had built the worker housing on the south side of the property, had established the company store, had hired the company doctor. He was not, in his own understanding, a man who exploited anyone. He was a man who provided. The mill provided employment to families who had no other options. The housing provided shelter. The store provided goods. The school, the mill school, opened September to November and March to April, provided education, such as it was, which he acknowledged was limited, but which was more than these families would have had without it. He had testified before the South Carolina State Committee on Labor twice, and before a House subcommittee once, and each time he had said essentially the same things, which were the things he believed, that his young workers were better off in the mill than idle, that the mill provided them with skills and structure, that their families depended on their wages, and that removing those wages would cause genuine hardship, that the reformers from the North who drove this legislation did not understand Southern conditions, and were, whatever their intentions, inserting themselves into a way of life they had no right to disturb. He was not lying. This is the thing about Nels Holmgren that is worse than if he had been lying. A liar knows the truth and performs a false version of it. Holmgren had not performed anything. He had looked at the children in his mill, Flossie on her crate, reaching up to the bobbin rail, the row of small backs bent over the spinning frames, the coughing that was endemic in the spinning room, and he had seen what he believed he saw, which was opportunity provided, families supported, community maintained. The children's presence in the mill was, in his mind, an act of civic generosity on his part. He had made them useful. He had kept them off the streets. He had given their families a path. The path led from poverty to slightly less poverty. It led from hunger to subsistence. It led from one generation of mill workers to the next, reliably and continuously, because the wage structure that required children's wages was the same wage structure that would require their children's wages, and the company school that produced functional illiterates produced them as efficiently as the spinning frames produced thread. And both products were exactly what the system required. Holmgren did not see this, not because he was stupid, he was not stupid, but because seeing it would have required him to understand himself as the cause of the conditions he was managing the effects of. He would have had to see the low adult wages as a choice, and the company store's pricing as a choice, and the company school's abbreviated calendar as a choice. Not tragic circumstances of poverty, not the natural conditions of Southern industrial life, but decisions made by him, within his power to change, that he had not changed because they served him. He would have had to see himself as the trap and not the safety net. He was not capable of this. Most people are not capable of this about themselves. His testimony before the House Subcommittee in February of 1916 included the following statement, recorded in the Congressional Record. "The children in my employ are well cared for and productive members of their families' support. They are learning a trade in conditions that I myself supervise. To remove them from useful employment would be to condemn their families to destitution. And I would ask the committee to consider whether the reformers who advocate this legislation have given the families themselves the chance to speak." He had arranged for 3 families from the mill to testify. All 3 had said their children's wages were necessary. All 3 were correct. None of them had chosen to say. And it would not have been safe to say, because the company house was still the company house, and the company store still controlled their credit, that the necessity had been manufactured. The cruelest systems are maintained not by the cruel, but by the sincere. The man who knows he is doing harm and continues can be confronted with his knowledge and shamed from it. The man who genuinely believes his harm is help is unreachable by that method, because the evidence of harm, presented to him, becomes in his mind evidence of how badly his help is needed. Show Holmgren a child coughing from cotton dust, and he sees a child who needs the job. Show him a family that cannot eat without their daughter's wages, and he sees a family he has sustained. The portrait is drawn in a light that always falls on him favorably, because he has arranged the light, because the light is what he lives in. The legislative fight was made harder, not easier, by men like Holmgren, not because he was the most powerful opponent. The large industrial interests were better organized and better funded, but because he was the respectable face of the opposition. He was not a villain. He was a businessman with a position. When newspapers covered the congressional hearings, Holmgren made good copy. The concerned employer, the defender of families, the man who had built something in his community and felt the reformers were threatening it. He was photographable in a way that worked in his favor. Broad, well-dressed, earnest. Hein's photographs of the children in Holmgren's mill were published in the NCLC's 1915 pamphlet, Child Labor in the Cotton Mill States. The pamphlet included Holmgren's name because the NCLC had learned that naming specific mills and specific owners was more effective than generality. Holmgren had written a letter to his senator, a letter that the senator had read into the congressional record, describing the NCLC's pamphlet as inflammatory propaganda, and the photographs as staged by outside agitators who imported poverty onto mill property that I and my family have built with honest labor. The photographs were not staged. Hein had photographed exactly what was there. The poverty was not imported. It had been there, reliably, for 26 years, because Holmgren's father had installed it at the foundation level, and Holmgren had maintained it with efficient care. When the Keating-Owen Act passed in September 1916, Holmgren wrote to his congressman that it was an unconstitutional assault on the rights of states to manage their own commerce. He was not wrong about the constitutional question. The law did present difficult Commerce Clause issues, and the mill industry had the foresight and resources to find the right test case quickly. Roland Dagenhart, a mill worker in Charlotte, North Carolina, sued on behalf of his 2 sons, whose employment at the Fidelity Manufacturing Company would be prohibited by the new law. The case reached the Supreme Court with the kind of speed that is available to cases with good funding behind them. In June 1918, less than 2 years after the Keating-Owen Act became law, the Supreme Court of the United States struck it down in Hammer v. Dagenhart. The majority opinion, written by Justice William Day, held that Congress had exceeded its power under the Commerce Clause. Manufacturing, the court held, was local. The goods had not yet entered interstate commerce when they were produced. Congress could regulate commerce. It could not regulate the conditions of manufacturing. The distinction was clean and legal and technically coherent, and had, as its practical consequence, the return of children to the machines the next morning. 9-year-olds went back to work. Legal reasoning has consequences. These are not abstract consequences, which flow from abstract arguments, which exist in the domain of ideas. These are consequences measured in specific ways, in children's hands, in spines, in lungs. The Supreme Court looked at an economy that had organized itself around the labor of children, had studied it, had been shown the photographs, had heard the testimony, had received the briefs, and determined that the constitutional architecture mattered more. The constitutional architecture was not wrong. The Constitution does have Commerce Clause limitations, and those limitations are real and have meaning, and in a differently configured case, the majority might have been right. But the majority was not thinking about Flossie on her crate. They were thinking about the Commerce Clause. Flossie was not in the jurisdiction they were considering. She went back to work. She was still there when Hine photographed her again in the spring of 1918. Older now, 10 going on 11, still small for her age, the cotton dust cough deeper than it had been in 1910. The NCLC used the photograph in their next campaign, which would produce the child labor tax law of 1919, which levied a 10% tax on the profits of businesses employing children. It was a different constitutional approach. Congress's taxing power, rather than its commerce power. The Supreme Court struck it down too, in 1922. Bailey v. Drexel Furniture Company. The same court, essentially, the same constitutional logic applied via a different door. The tax was, the court held, not really a tax, but a regulatory penalty, and therefore exceeded Congress's power. Flossie was 14 in 1922. She was still coughing. After 2 Supreme Court defeats in 4 years, the NCLC and its allies turned to the only constitutional option they had left, an amendment. A proposed amendment to the Constitution, approved by Congress in June 1924, would have given Congress the power to regulate the labor of persons under 18 years of age. It did not require a constitutional crisis to defeat. It required enough states to refuse to ratify it, and enough states refused. The opposition was coordinated and well-funded, and used arguments that deserve examination because of how they worked. Because they worked on families like the Cutshaws and the Honeycutts, as much as on anyone else. Because they were designed to. The National Manufacturers Association, the American Farm Bureau, the textile industry, and various conservative religious organizations argued that the amendment was, variously, an intrusion on states' rights, an attack on parental authority, socialism, communism, Bolshevism, the first step toward federal control of children's minds. The Bolshevism argument, Bolshevist bait for a Soviet America, was an actual phrase used in anti-amendment literature, would be funny if it hadn't worked. The Soviet Union had also recently banned child labor, a fact that the amendment's opponents used as evidence of the amendment's ideological pedigree. The circular logic required was, Child labor reform is what communists support. Therefore, supporting child labor reform is communist. Therefore, voting against child labor reform is patriotic. This logic was deployed at school board meetings and state legislative sessions, and in pamphlets that reached working-class communities across the South and Midwest, where suspicion of federal overreach was already substantial and could be amplified by people with financial interest in doing so. The family argument was more insidious. The opponents of the amendment argued that it would take from parents the right to determine how their children spent their time, that it was an intrusion on the family by the federal government. This argument was received with some sympathy in communities where it was heard, including communities where the families it pretended to protect were the families sending their children to work at 5 in the morning for 40 cents a day. Here is the thing about the family argument that requires sitting with. The families who depended on child wages depended on them, because the factory owners had structured adult wages to require it. The dependency that the opponents called tradition, the family that worked together, the children who contributed, the economic unit of the mill family, was a dependency that the mill had engineered and then romanticized. They had created the trap, and then they called the trap family values, and then they defended the trap as though defending it were defending the family. They created the dependency. Then they called the dependency tradition. Then they defended the tradition as though it were something they had found rather than something they had built. The amendment was never ratified. By 1932, only 28 states had ratified it, far short of the 36 needed. In 1924, the year the amendment was proposed, an estimated 1.5 million children were still working in American industry. Hine continued. There is something almost supernatural, in retrospect, about Lewis Hine's persistence over these years. He was not a wealthy man. He was paid by the NCLC on a per-trip basis, expenses included, and the travel was hard and constant. Weeks away from New York, in boarding houses with thin walls and poor heat, eating whatever the boarding house served, traveling by whatever transportation connected one mill town to the next. He was regularly threatened, occasionally assaulted in the minor ways available to foremen who couldn't risk doing something reportable, frequently deceived by managers who knew his reputation and arranged what he would see accordingly. He adapted. He arrived unannounced. He varied his disguises. He developed relationships with workers and families outside the gates who were more forthcoming than anyone inside, because outside the gate there was no company house to lose, and no company credit to be cut off. And sometimes just being heard was worth the risk. He was a sociologist who had become a photographer by necessity. The NCLC had needed images, and Hine could take them. And the sociologist and the photographer were never quite separable in him. The photographs were evidence, but they were also, more than that, acts of witness. He was there when no one else with a camera and a national platform was there. The children in his photographs were not, in their own experience, being documented. They were working, they were looking up when a strange man pointed something at them. They were going back to work. But in the act of standing in front of them with a camera, in writing down their names and their heights and their ages and their jobs, he was doing something that no one in the system of their exploitation was designed to do. He was treating them as individuals who existed in history, as people whose specific presence in a specific place at a specific moment mattered enough to record. This is not nothing. In the lives of people whom systems treat as interchangeable, as units of production, as fractions of a wage cost, as small nimble fingers attached to a class of body, being treated as an individual is not nothing. It is, in the taxonomy of what can be given to a person, one of the more significant things. Cleo Ash knew this too. In her testimony notebooks, she recorded names, she recorded ages, she recorded the specific circumstances of specific families. She did not write a mill family in Gaston County. She wrote the name of the the name of the mother, the names of the children, their ages, their wages, their working hours, their health conditions as described. She did not do this because it made better pamphlets, though it did. She did it because the people she talked to deserved to exist in her notebooks in the same particular way they existed in their own lives, as people, not as data points in a generalized argument about labor conditions. Together, Hine and Ash had, by 1915, accumulated a record of American child labor that was unprecedented in its scope and specificity. Hundreds of photographs, thousands of pages of testimony, payroll records they had obtained through channels that were sometimes transparent and sometimes not, company store ledgers, factory floor plans, chemical analyses of mill air, medical records from company doctors who had occasionally been willing to say what the cotton dust was doing. The NCLC published this material in a series of pamphlets that were, for their time, models of what would later be called investigative journalism. Documented, sourced, specific, aimed at a public that reformers believed could be moved if the information was made visible enough. The information was made visible. The public was moved. The legislation passed. The legislation was struck down. The constitutional amendment failed. The children remained in the factories. This is the part of the story that can produce, if you are not careful, a kind of despair about the relationship between evidence and change, a sense that the evidence had been sufficient, the argument had been won, and the children still went back to work the next morning. And what is the point of the photographs if the photographs couldn't save the children in them? The point is this: the photographs could not save the children in them. They were taken too early, and the law came too late, and the children in Hine's glass plates spent their childhoods in the factories, and many of them never fully recovered, never read fluently, never held a job that wasn't determined by what their bodies had learned on a factory floor before they were old enough to choose. The photographs did not save Flossie or Early, or the unnamed girl who shucked oysters before dawn. They were 30 years early for that. What the photographs did was build an argument that could not be rebuilt from scratch by each new generation of reformers. They created a record. They made the specific out of the general, names instead of numbers, bodies instead of statistics. And they ensured that anyone who came after and wanted to deny that this had happened would have to deny it in the face of specific, documented faces. The Fair Labor Standards Act was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt on June 25, 1938. It had taken 34 years from the founding of the NCLC, 30 years from Hine's first photograph in 1908. 2 Supreme Court defeats, 1 failed constitutional amendment, a decade of economic depression that had, paradoxically, helped the cause, not because suffering produces justice, which it does not reliably, but because the Depression had created the political conditions in which FDR's New Deal could pass, and the FLSA was part of the New Deal, and the child labor provisions were part of the FLSA, and the political coalition that made all of this possible was not the coalition of morality that reformers had tried to build since 1904, but the coalition of economic crisis that happened to be available in 1938. The act restricted the employment of children under 16 in most industries. It restricted the employment of children under 18 in hazardous occupations. It set minimum wages and maximum hours for covered workers, which addressed at the federal level for the first time the adult wage suppression that had made child labor economically necessary. It was not complete. Agricultural labor was largely excluded and would remain a site of child exploitation for decades. The domestic service exemption left some domestic child workers unprotected. The enforcement mechanisms were real, but not infinitely funded. The law drew lines around the worst of it. It did not instantly and completely end all of it. But for the cotton mills, the coal mines, the glass factories, the canneries, for the spinning frames and the breaker boys and the shucking tables, it was the end. The system that had run on children's bodies, children's wages, children's hours for 60 years had reached its legal conclusion. Social change is not a speech. It is not a moment. It does not arrive in the form of a speech before a moved Congress that then acts with dispatch and conscience. It is a siege. Years of evidence, years of defeat, years of the same argument made again to different people under different political conditions. Years of photographs taken in rooms where photographs weren't supposed to be taken. Years of testimony recorded from people who had nothing to gain from giving it, except the possibility that someone was listening. It is decades of the obvious being denied by people with financial interest in the denial, until the political circumstances change enough that the obvious can finally be written into law. It took 34 years to get the obvious into law. The obvious being, children should not work in factories. Children should not sit hunched over coal chutes for 10 hours a day. Children should not shuck oysters before dawn until the acid burns their hands raw. Children should be in school. Children should grow up with the use of their spines and their lungs and their fingers. This was not a complicated idea. It required 34 years. In the summer of 1938, a few weeks after the FLSA was signed, Flossie Cutshaw, who was 37 years old, which meant she had been a child worker for 28 of the 30 years that Hine had spent documenting child labor, and which is to say, she had been old enough when the law passed to have a daughter the age she was when Hine first photographed her, was living in the same mill village in a different cottage. She was no longer working the spinning frames. Her lungs had been bad for years, the deep-settled cough of the cotton mill, and she had been moved to a piecework operation in the sewing room, which was quieter and dustier in a different way. She had married at 18, a man named Dace, who was also a mill worker, and they had 2 children, a son named Hugh, who was 16 and had started in the mill at 12, and a daughter named Emma, who was 13 and had been in the mill for 8 months. Emma would not go back to the mill after the FLSA. This is not a triumphant sentence. Emma Cutshaw was 13 and had been working in a mill for 8 months, and her lungs were already learning what cotton dust felt like, and she had never been past the 4th grade. The law that stopped her from returning stopped her after the damage had started. The law was 30 years late for her mother and 28 years late for her, and it was on time, exactly on time, for the child she might someday have. That is the arithmetic of social change. You are always saving the people who come after, and you are always too late for the people you can see. Flossie Cutshaw did not know who Lewis Hine was. She had been in his photograph in 1910 and again in 1918, and she had not known, either time, what he was doing with his camera. She had been 9 and 10, going on 11, and a man had pointed something at her and written something down, and then moved on, and she had moved on too. If someone had told her that her picture was in a pamphlet in Washington, D.C., she would have had no frame in which to place that information. Washington, D.C. was not in the world as she knew it. The world as she knew it was the mill and the village and the road between them. Her daughter Emma would know the world differently. Not well, not with the scope and mobility that wealth allows, not with the education that years in school provide, because Emma's 4 years of school were not enough, and the economic limitations of the mill village were not ended by the FLSA, only slightly loosened. But Emma would not have the cough by the time she was 9. Emma would not learn, at 8 years old, to sort the world into real, serious, and unchangeable. Emma would have access to the category of changeable, which her mother had been denied. That is not nothing. Early Honeycutt had left the mines at 15, when his father's arm recovered enough to do light surface work, and the family's arithmetic shifted slightly. He had not recovered his back. The curve persisted, and would persist, and would cause him a specific kind of chronic pain from his mid-20s onward, that he managed with the same bleak stoicism he'd applied to being hit by the foreman. He had gone to work in a hardware store in Scranton at 16, where the owner, a man named Kaufman, who was, by the accidents of biography, a person who had not had to send his children to work in mines, had noticed that Early could read and add figures, and had given him more responsibility over time. Early had eventually bought the store from Kaufman's widow in 1932, in the middle of the Depression, which was not ideal timing, but which he had managed with the arithmetic precision of a man who had been tracking numbers his entire life. He did not tell his children about the breaker. Not for years. It was not a story he knew how to tell to people who hadn't been there, because the things that were hardest to explain were the things that seemed smallest. The 10-minute break, the biscuit, the foreman's stick, the cold. He could tell them what he'd done, and he could tell them when, but he couldn't tell them what it had done to his understanding of what the world was, which was something that could require your body before you were done growing, that could take your hours and your back and a layer of skin off your fingers, and owe you nothing for it. He voted in every election after he turned 21. He followed the FLSA debates in the newspaper in 1938, and when it passed, he sat in his store after closing and looked at the news for a while without saying anything. There was no speech available to him for what he felt. He was 38 years old. He had been in the breaker at 11. His children were not going to be in the breaker. That was the entirety of what there was to say, and he had said it in his own mind. And that was enough. Orpha Dills, whose name Hine had written in his notebook as unknown, continued in the canneries until she was 18, at which point she married a shrimper from Pascagoula and moved into a slightly different economic difficulty that was not organized around shucking shellfish before dawn. She never spoke of the cannery years in any way that indicated she understood them to have been exceptional. They were the years she had worked in the cannery. They were followed by different years. This is how it is when you have not been given access to the frame that would let you see your own experience as something other than ordinary. The dress that she had seen in the shop window in Biloxi, the teal dress, the one that had occupied a small permanent space in her mind since she was 7, she never bought. Not because she couldn't eventually afford it, though for many years she couldn't. Because she had been carrying the image of it for so long, in the specific form in which a 7-year-old girl at 3:30 in the morning carries the image of a beautiful thing she has seen and cannot have, that buying it would have changed the image into a dress, and the image was worth more than any dress could be. She was buried in Pascagoula in 1961, at age 57. Her name appears nowhere in historical records. It appears in Lewis Hine's notebook as unknown, and in Cleo Ash's observation notes as the smaller girl at the second table, and in neither record does she receive more than a few words. But she was there, and she was 7, and she was shucking oysters before dawn in November in 1911, and Lewis Hine stood in front of her with a camera, and committed to what he saw, and the photograph is in the Library of Congress now, and it shows a child who did not raise her eyes, and her presence in it is permanent, and it is the only record that she existed. Lewis Hine spent the years after his NCLC work in further photographic projects, including, in 1930 and 1931, the construction of the Empire State Building, the famous Men at Work series, images of ironworkers balanced on steel beams at enormous heights, photographs that share with his NCLC work a fundamental quality. They show labor as it is, in the body, at scale, with the scale making the labor visible in a way that abstract description cannot. The man at 500 feet is readable as a man, a small figure against an enormous structure. In the same way, the child at the spinning frame is readable as a child against an enormous machine. The method was the same. The subject had changed from what should not be to what is remarkable. He was not well compensated. He had never been well compensated. The NCLC paid him per project. The Men at Work book sold modestly. The Depression reduced the market for documentary photography to nearly nothing. By the late 1930s, he was in genuine financial difficulty, behind on rent, borrowing from friends, applying for grants from organizations that did not always come through. He was not bitter about this, as best as anyone could tell from his correspondence, though he was accurate about it. He wrote to friends with a matter-of-fact accounting of his situation that was recognizable as the same precision he'd applied to recording children's heights and wages. He died on November 3, 1940, 2 years after the Fair Labor Standards Act he had spent 30 years of photographs helping to create. He died broke, which is the particular fate available to people who spend their working lives creating public goods. Goods that belong to everyone and are therefore owned by no one, in the sense that no one pays for them directly. His photographs belonged to everyone. His financial situation belonged to him alone. His work was donated to the Photo League of New York and later transferred to the Library of Congress, where it resides in the National Child Labor Committee collection. The collection contains roughly 5,000 photographs taken between 1908 and 1918. Each one is captioned: name, age, height, job, location, date. Each one represents a specific moment in which a specific child existed, was seen, was recorded, and was given the weight of evidence rather than the weightlessness of the undocumented. In the Library of Congress, the collection is indexed and searchable. You can look up Sadie Pfeiffer, 48 inches tall, Lancaster, South Carolina, and find her there. You can find Addie Card, 12 years old, Spinner, Vermont. You can find the Breaker boys in rows over the coal chutes, their faces turned up or down, caught in the specific moment of Heinz' shutter. You can find the cannery workers and the glass factory boys and the newsboys on city streets after midnight, and the small figures in tobacco fields in the Carolina heat. They are named. They are measured. They are specific. This was what the system took from them first: specificity. The system worked best when children were interchangeable. When one 9-year-old at a spinning frame was the same as another 9-year-old at a spinning frame, when they could be replaced without documentation and worked without record and discarded without account. The great efficiency of the industrial child labor system was its ability to treat human beings as fractions of production costs, to make the specific general, to make the child into a category. The child labor industry required, above all, that children not be fully seen. Lewis Hine made them visible. He couldn't do anything about the cough in Flossie Cutshaw's lungs, or the curve beginning in early Honeycutt's back, or the acid on Orpha Dills's 7-year-old hands. He was a man with a camera and a lunch pail and a vest calibrated to measure the heights of children in places he wasn't supposed to be. He could not undo what the system had done and was doing. He could not speed the law that was 30 years away. He could photograph. He could write down the names. He could measure the heights and record the wages and note the time of day and the condition of the hands and the angle of the backs. He could take the general, child labor, and make it specific. This child, this age, this height, this place, this morning. He could stand in front of Flossie Cutshaw, 9 years old, 4 feet tall, in a cotton mill in Lancaster, South Carolina, on a November morning in 1910, and he could open his camera, and he could mean it. He couldn't save the children in the photographs. He made sure the children in the photographs saved the ones who came after. He gave them the one thing the system took first. He made them visible.